Morning. Good morning. We are currently working our way through Matthew's Gospel, and we arrived at today's reading. Now, I'm going to tackle the first of the two passages this morning, but actually what I'm going to say could probably apply to both. And the first thing that I need to acknowledge really is just quite how strange and unfamiliar that first reading sounds to us these days. It may be that some of you are regulars in church, you've heard that story before, and you're very familiar. It may be, because you're here to support Josh and Susie, that this might be your first time in a church, and you're listening to that story thinking, what on earth was that all about? That is one of the strangest things I have heard in a long time. Well, what I want to do this morning is give us a little bit of a framework for how we might think about that, because I want to suggest to you that the story we've heard read this morning, well, the gap between the story we read this morning and the world we find ourselves in these days is perhaps at its largest at this point. We live in a world where we have split the atom. We have sent rockets into space. We have launched satellites. What does that have to do with this strange story from 2,000 years ago where we read of demons and men coming out of tombs and exorcisms? So what I want to do this morning is give us a little bit of a framework for how we might hold these two together. And I want to suggest to you a journey that I think many of us go on, but also I think that society has gone on and that we can see very clearly. And I'm going to break it into three sections. The first section we might describe as supernatural. The second is the scientific. And then finally, I want to propose a third stage, which I've called integrated. Now, we might recognize a journey between those stages for us as individuals. We might also recognize it within society. We might talk about pre-modern and modern post-Enlightenment, the scientific world that we live in. And then we might also talk now about postmodern, post the end of the First World War. We've talked about the postmodern era. Another way of thinking about it, which I'm indebted to a guy called Ken Wilberforce, is to recognize these three boxes as what he calls pre-rational, rational, and trans-rational. Now, I'm going to explain what those mean over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. But the first thing is to say that a pre-rational view is not thought of critically in his world. There are many things we do where we respond before our thinking brain has time to take in. Think of flashes of anger, flashes of adrenaline, rushes. You see a child walking towards a road and that instinctive response. It happens really quickly in the brain. And you can observe under an MRI scanner that it happens before the thinking part of the brain kicks in, before the rational part has time to respond. We've already reacted. So I want to take us on a bit of a journey about how we might think about demons and the supernatural these days, using this as a bit of a framework. Now, I suggest to begin with, there's probably two groups in this room right now. Sorry, I thought that was funny. I'll give you a moment to catch up with it. There are two groups in this room right now, I would guess. And I'm probably in the process of, so far, I've alienated both of you. So we're going to see if we can pull this back together. The first group is saying, there is a supernatural world out there. There is a world full of angels and there is a world full of demons, and it is entirely unseen, but I have no doubt in it whatsoever. The Bible talks about it and explains this world to us. You are very open to the idea of the supernatural. And that might be because of some experience that you've had in your life, where you feel you've experienced something that was, quite frankly, supernatural. I love listening to people's stories of that, their experiences. Sometimes they're strange to listen to, but who am I to question somebody else's experience, somebody else's story? And I love to hear stories from people who will talk about just sometimes the strange experiences we have on this journey through life. Interestingly, I've read a couple of books in this last few weeks. I read Dave Grohl's autobiography, the lead singer of the Foo Fighters, pretty tough, heavy metal kind of a guy. And then a biography by a guy called David Goggins, and it's not a very good book, I don't recommend it. But he was an ex-Navy SEAL, another tough guy who then went on to do ultramarathons. And both of them talk absolutely unapologetically in their books about some kind of supernatural experience they've had in their lives. Dave Grohl talks about actually going to visit a psychic is what he talks about. And Goggins talks about being aware that his grandfather had passed away before he got the phone call. He just says he knew it. And then an hour later he took the phone call and he knew what the phone call was going to be about. They're stories from two individuals you would not expect them to be all woo-woo. But yet it's just part of the narrative that they explain. So one group are going, yeah, come on, that's the way the world is. I know that's the way the world is. I've experienced it. And then there's a second group who consider themselves to have moved beyond those kind of ideas. Moved on into a more critical space, a more scientific, a more rational space. And they look back at that supernatural conversation, and actually they prefer to brand it superstitious. And from this rational perspective, it's branded as irrational, because there must be some other explanation for all of that. We just haven't found it yet. Notice that both of those two are kind of have a judgmentalism to them, superstitious, irrational. As if we feel as if we're a bit better because we're more evolved. We found this new consciousness. And it's often in that move that people reject faith at some point during their life. They look back at that earlier stage and go, it was all a bit woo-woo, wasn't it? Because we're now a modern society, we know better than that. And what fascinates me, and what I hope to do a bit of study on later on in this year, is that move, and actually how we can support people through that move. Because often it's that move where they end up rejecting faith. And I want to say that the scientific reductionism, the fruit of the Enlightenment, I am massively grateful for, and we all should be. Advances in medicine, advances in technology, the whole scientific method, scientific reductionism, to give it its name, has borne so much good stuff, so many good innovations in our world and in our lives. I am massively grateful for it. It has taught us about how the world works. We're able to put things under the microscope, and we're able to look into atoms and now into subatomic worlds. And we know so much more than we used to. The challenge is sometimes when you put the butterfly under the microscope, you have to kill it and pin it down first. You know, the group of you that are saying, yes, we're in this this is where it is, this is where the juice is, this is the way the world is. Everything can be observed and broken down into its smallest parts. It can be put on a spreadsheet. It can be formularized. It can be analyzed. And that's great. And it works. Until it doesn't. And then there is always a point where that, I have found, just stops working. Now, it's at this point, I would normally go on to one of my other hobby horses, which is quantum physics. You'll be glad to know I'm not going to do that this morning. I did a lecture about that a few years ago, and it's online if you want to watch it. But suffice to say that the world of physics, a few years ago when I was studying physics in the late 80s, early 90s, thought the world was wrapped up. We were about to find the single equation that would unite all the forces in the universe, and Newton's clockwork universe would be solved, and we'd know how it was. It's just action and reaction. And then along comes Einstein and goes, hold on, it's a lot weirder than you think it is. There's some whole strangeness here. And it's fascinating. The whole world gets thrown up in the air. But I said I wouldn't go into that, so I won't. You see, perhaps scientific reductionism isn't the panacea that we think it is. I came across this quote this week in another book, Spiritual Intelligence, that I was listening to out on a run. Ludwig Wittgenstein. We feel that even if all possible scientific questions be answered, the problems of life have still not been touched at all. We feel that even if all the possible scientific questions be answered, the problems of life have still not been touched at all. You see, the scientific worldview is incredibly good at answering the how questions. It's just not so good at answering why. It can tell you how a kettle boils. It can tell you about the flow of electricity, the excitement of atoms, the transfer of energy, the water breaking free, boiling, breaking free into steam. It's really rubbish at telling you why someone put the kettle on. Because they're two different questions to life. It can explain love. Biologists can explain love as a welling up of oxytocin in the brain. You can imagine Sarah and I, next time we're out on a date, sitting in a sunset. Darling, I feel oxytocin rising up within me for you. I just get a slap. When we talk about love, we reach for poetry. We reach for flowers to reflect that beauty. We reach for music. We reach for art. See, because that scientific worldview, it's great, and it is great. I don't want to knock it. I'm a big fan. What a stupid thing to say. It has given us so much in our lives. But it works until it doesn't. I have a friend, a school friend, a very good school friend. We meet up annually. We've done a lot of walking holidays together. He is one of the brightest guys I've ever come across. He did his PhD at Warwick. He was chair of the university challenge team that won that particular year. He now studies at Cambridge in the department at the university where they decoded the genome, and he works on that. He is a properly smart cookie, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my conversations with him over the years. A couple of years ago, their daughter was born, and she was born with multiple complicated health issues that involved her having to stay in Gosh, Great Ormond Street, for the first year of her life, and having 8 different surgeries, one within a couple of hours of being born, to save her life. Massively grateful that during that stay they were managed to do the operations in the right order and fix everything and sort it out, and actually she will live a normal, full, happy, healthy life at the end of that process. And as a PS, I'm doing a long triathlon in about 6 weeks' time, and I'm going to do it sponsored for Gosh in order to raise money just out of gratitude for the way they treated Howard, Nellie, and Isabella. But we went for a walk the other day, and he was telling me this story, talking about the year that he'd had. And just at the end of it, just casually, he mentioned, and I just started going into the church opposite my house and just sitting there during services. So he doesn't really know why, but just sometimes we need to search for something that is beyond, because our circumstances demand it, and because we can't find the answers in all the usual, very rational places. So now I've really offended both of you. So what do we move to beyond that? How can we live in a world where actually we can hold these two realities together? And it's what I would call, how do we live with an integrated perspective on faith? And I have to say, as over the years I've done this job, I have discovered that this is my passion. This is what gets me out of bed in the mornings. If I was to look at Simon Sinek's book, Know Your Why, I think this is probably my why. How do I live well as a Christian pastor, and hold these two realities together in all their apparent contradiction, but also in all of their reality. It's actually when I do start the doctorate in Durham in September, it's the area that I intend to do a little bit of study and a little bit of writing and reading and work about. How do we hold all that is good and hold them together? And somebody, I have to say, who's helped me massively on this journey personally, because I have been through this journey and very nearly walked away from faith in the process, except it paid for my house and it made my family homeless, so I couldn't really do that. A person that's been really helpful as I've walked this journey myself has been a guy called Rob Bell, an American pastor. And he suggests that as we go on this journey, the important thing to do is to not be critical of your earlier selves. So as you journey through, is not to look back and go, oh, that was so, we can treat with disdain sometimes the thinking that we feel we've left behind. And he uses this phrase to transcend and include. So as we move, we need to find ways to integrate all our earlier selves into a place we find ourselves. I'm going to read this quote, but it probably isn't helpful. A transrational faith that includes and integrates the mind and intellect while at the same time transcending it. What is easier to understand is this picture. Many of us start in a world where we don't question the supernatural. We then end up exposed to a scientific world, and the trick is to now not look back on that earlier self with disdain, but to think, how do I hold these together? Until eventually we live an integrated life where we hold the whole lot together. Why have I done that? Why have I spent 10 minutes on that? Because I hope it's helpful. Because it certainly has been for me over the years. But also I want to put it as a framework for now how we go back to the passage. And we think about this strange story where we're talking about demon possession and exorcism. And this herd of pigs that suddenly rush off and then drown themselves. This very strange, alien, unfamiliar story. One other thing. There is always the thing, and then there are the stories we tell about the thing. In semiotics, it's the signifier and the signified, but don't worry about that. There is the thing and the story we tell about the thing. There is the moon. Go back 2,000 years. The moon was deified. We held feasts when it returned. We worshipped it, this strange orb that seemed to rule the night, the light in the sky that seemed to have such an impact on us. The moon was always still the moon, but that was the story we told about it. Then, within living memory of some folk in this room, we landed on it. And we put a spaceship up there, and somebody walked on it. And now we have a different story about the moon. Because we know what it's made of. Where there are rocks, you can go and see them in the Natural History Museum. There are rocks from the moon, you can see them. And then there was the other day I was sat down in Pevensey and all my family had gone to bed. And there was a low blood red moon in the sky. And Instagram was littered of pictures of it from all over the UK. And I sat in the evening in the chair and I stared out the window, took this photograph and pondered life. I read this about the passage today. Demons symbolize the mysterious evil forces that internally disrupt right thinking and right behavior. And Jesus is presented as God's supreme agent whose power far exceeds the power of evil. I guess we've all experienced what we would describe as good and evil in our world. And many of us know what it is to wrestle with our demons, do we not? Those impulses towards self-destruction. Talk to any alcoholic, any addict. They know what it is to wrestle with their demons. When he arrived at the other side in the region of the Gadarenes, we're told this, the Gadarenes was the Gentile. Jesus is a Jew and he's gone to the other side of the lake, and this is Gentile territory. It's the region of the Gadarenes. 2 demon-possessed men coming from the tombs met him. They were so violent that no one could pass by. The tombs were probably caves where they buried people and rolled stones in front. And these men were so ostracized from society that they had come and they were living in these caves, effectively homeless. One thing I wonder, and often is wondered in several of the commentaries, is might these men have been suffering with schizophrenia? That might be a logical possibility. It doesn't remove the miracle from Jesus, it just removes it from exorcism to healing. Just now, as we look back, we might think, actually, and by that's not to say that I think we need to be exorcising any kind of mental illness these days. It's just that's the label they put on it back then. We might today call it something different. And some distance from them, a large herd of pigs was feeding. The demons begged Jesus, if you drive us out, send us into the herd of pigs. Many of you will know this, but pigs were considered unclean animals within Jewish culture. We know this. You don't eat pork, you don't keep pigs. Another clue that we're in a Gentile territory because there were herds of pigs. In the narrative, in Jewish consciousness, this is the unclean entering the unclean. Being sent into the pigs was just the unclean being sent into the unclean. And he said to them, go! Authority. And they came out and they went into the pigs, and the whole herd rushed down the steep bank to the lake and died in the water. Several commentators noted that this might be a kind of Jewish joke. Now, there's a cultural gap, if ever there was one. Because we don't get that joke. But the herd of pigs being evil, the evil being cast into the evil, and then going and drowning themselves was kind of a sideways joke in the culture. But the key thing is that Jesus has authority and that evil leads to death and destruction. But that Jesus has authority over it. So it is not to be feared. Those tending the pigs ran off and went into town and reported all this, including what had happened to the demon-possessed men. The whole town went out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they pleaded with him to leave the region. Again, another strange response to this healing, to this exorcism. Why are they upset with Jesus? Well, quite plainly, because your wealth was in your livestock. There were no banks on the corner for you to take your money to. Your wealth was in your livestock. Somebody has lost a lot of money in their culture in this action, and they're disrupted. And they would rather live with the unhealth of the possessed men than risk their wealth. They would rather live with wealth and unhealth than risk their wealth for the sake of health. Again, from the same commentary, those who are called by Jesus to be followers today, as in the first century, must expect to be unwelcome amongst those whose religious or economic security is threatened. To name the demons in modern society is to incur disfavor. And I'm heading towards the end with this thought. I don't know whether any of you have read Dostoevsky's novel Demons. Hand up, I haven't. But I have read a lot about it in this week. And what's fascinating about it and what drew me to it is because this story is central to that novel. It opens with this narrative from the Bible. And Dostoevsky, in his novel, it's a big narrative story. But what he identifies with these demons are the various isms in society. Communism, socialism, capitalism, materialism. To name the demons into the modern society is to incur disfavor. And his idea that these isms become herds. They go from the individual and they become the herd, and then we get swept up in the herd by this being caught up in the isms of society. And our call as Christians is to reject those isms and focus instead on Christ. I'm running out of time. I can't say any more about that. Just to finish up, I do think the most important thing about this passage, and it flows on from last week's sermon, is really what's key about this is Jesus' identity. If you remember at the end of the passage we finished in Matthew last week, we read this. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" The question is, who is this before them that can calm the storm, that casts out demons, that in the second reading forgives sins? And interestingly, Matthew has the answer on the lips of these two possessed men when they say, "What do you want with us, Son of God?" Friends, I don't know where you are this morning. I hope this morning was helpful. It may or may not have been, looking at some of the glazed faces, but I hope it was helpful. It certainly has been to me. I am passionate about how do we live a fully integrated life that is open to the mystery and the inexplicable, but at the same time recognizes that the world we live in and the benefits of it. And within all of the midst of that, what does it mean to confess that this individual, Jesus, was the Son of God? It has been a life of wrestling so far, and a life of a lot more wrestling to go. But I know I am captivated by it and passionate about it. How do we live in the light of this reality? How do we allow it to shape us? How do we allow this story to help us to live well in the world and to wrestle with all of our own demons? Amen.